Episode 2. A Big Decision. On the other side of Wakahira, miles from the castle, near the woods where a few houses stood next to each other, yet still leaving a decent-sized gap in between, lived a family of 3. The father, mother, and son, who had just turned 18 2 weeks prior. At that moment, he was being trained by his father. The young man's name was Omari, his father's name was Jabari. Jabari was a black male with short, nappy hair, brown eyes, medium lips with a beard and mustache, and toned body that showed he was no stranger to a good workout. Although not huge, he was well built. His son Omari was also a dark-skinned male, the same height as his father at 5'10". He had the same color eyes, slightly bigger lips, and a beard and mustache that were just starting to grow. Omari's body was also toned, but not as much as his father. Jabari had been training Omari in martial arts since he was the age of 10. As a second hand, Omari was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and join the military. This was because although villagers were no longer forced, their situation was quite unique, and not in a good way. Even worse, despite being taught all the skills to be a serious threat and being a second hand, Omari didn't like fighting, which was unusual for a gifted individual of all kinds. The situation they faced traces back to the time when the Kingdom Valorira, among others, would compel gifted individuals into marriage. Although this occurred before Omari's birth, he was still impacted. Jabari's father, Omari's grandfather Amir, a gifted man coerced into marrying a woman he did not love to produce an offspring. He was also forced to undergo trials via the king's orders, yet he failed to pass the trials after taking them twice. The king's law stated that an individual only had 2 attempts at the trials, or they could never trial again. Fortunately, a new rule was later added, granting failed candidates a chance to train with the military, living on base for a year, to improve their odds of success. However, this came too late for Amir, who had already tried twice. Despite not making the cut himself, Amir was still expected to train Jabari. Once Jabari had reached the age of 9 years, Amir began his training. Years later, after much effort, Jabari achieved what his father could not. He passed the king's trials, being one of the few to be accepted in the military that day. The king then wanted to force Jabari to marry, so he too could eventually create an offspring when the time was right who could achieve what he had. However, Amir was vehemently opposed to the idea. He rebelled against the king, urging his son to do the same, as he did not want Jabari to marry a woman he did not love for someone else's gain. The king, who was slightly different at the time, disliked their rebellion. However, he wanted to resolve the situation peacefully since Jabari had become a soldier. Reluctantly, the king offered Amir golden krugers as payment for his son's marriage to another woman. Since it would be a while before Jabari received his first payment, and their financial situation not being the best at the time, Amir had to accept King Khalan's offer, but requested that the woman at least be beautiful enough for his son. Although the king got what he wanted, his pride was wounded, feeling that as a king, he should never have had to pay them in the first place. He was so upset that he didn't even want to tell Isaiah and Bodin, his 2 nobles. So consequently, not only were Jabari and the chosen woman to marry, but their offspring Omari was required, without exception, to pass the trials and join the military, or the king might imprison his whole family. That's if the years don't soften him up a bit. The second trial involves a fight between individuals, but Omari was a pacifist, so he had to face a unique challenge in that regard. Learning of his son's drawbacks, Jabari continued pushing Omari in his training as hard as he could. He feared what King Khalan might do to them if Omari didn't measure up. If only Amir had allowed Jabari to be married without payment, they wouldn't be in their situation. There was no severe punishment for those who failed to pass the trial for the first and second time other than them never trying again. Just because one wasn't military strong didn't mean said individual couldn't help fight for their homeland and families during an invasion. Yet they were in a pickle only Omari could get them out of. Omari had no idea of the truth, as his father kept it hidden from him. He wanted to motivate and change his son in other ways rather than put immense pressure on him with such information. He would even teach his son brand new techniques from the military after learning them himself during his time, yet nothing worked. Omari just viewed all of it as his father trying to control his future. Since soldiers didn't have to go overseas and rarely visited other kingdoms, they would be allowed to go home more often than soldiers were centuries down the line. This made it possible for gifted people to train their young. Omari had faced confrontational situations before during his time at cathedral school, which he attended from ages 7 to 15 before being pulled out to focus more on his training, because it was also around the time Omari's father left the military after serving all his necessary time. Of course, he tried to talk his way out of the situation, and when that didn't work, he resorted to running away. Luckily, he was faster than the other student and avoided the fight. However, it came with a price, as a few students laughed at him and decided to call him weak right to his face, as if they knew he wouldn't do anything. And they were right. He never did anything physically to retaliate. He may have told few people off, but had never thrown a punch. But just like any other school, even cathedral schools had mischievous students. The situation also led to Omari's parents being suspicious about their son. It wasn't that they condoned school fighting, they were more so surprised their son did not fight once they were informed of the events and learned what and who started the situation. They were more so surprised, given that he had already been training. Since Jabari was a great fighter in his youth, he hoped to have passed it down to Omari, along with his telekinetic talent. Instead, over time, he felt as if his powers were the only thing Omari inherited from him, while the rest came from his mother Ada. Jabari and Omari stood opposite each other, with a bit of distance in between. Looking at his son with a slight grin, he told him, "Today, we're going to be working on your dodging reflexes. Like I always say, if they can't touch you, they can't beat you." Omari chimed in his final words, as if he'd heard enough times before. Jabari stood with several stones lying on the ground surrounding him, all varying in size. Some were huge, almost the size of cinder blocks, while others looked like broken-down pieces. Suddenly, a plethora of them hovered in the air all at the same time. "You better not let these hit you." Jabari spoke louder to ensure Omari could hear his words. However, upon hearing those words, Omari's stomach filled with butterflies, as if he'd never done the exercise before. The truth was, Omari greatly lacked self-confidence. "I want you to use the staff this time. Grab it, then get in your fighting stance," Jabari instructed. Omari used his powers to pull in the all-black staff he'd often trained with, lying on the ground next to Jabari, catching it with 2 hands. As soon as Omari complied, stones began to fly in his direction, propelled by telepathy. Omari quickly stepped to the side, avoiding the first stone, then ducked to avoid the second aimed at his head, but Jabari had chosen a small stone to throw, just in case it made contact. Omari then jumped to the side to evade the third stone, then used his staff to whack away the fourth and fifth, but the sixth stone was way too big. This continued until Jabari had thrown them all. Even after throwing all the stones, Jabari wasn't finished. Using his powers, he picked the thrown stones up once more and sent them back towards Omari, only in multiple directions that time. "Watch out, I'm not done yet," he warned. Omari continued to dodge skillfully as he began to feel better about himself, but it was short-lived once Jabari began to speed up his throws, getting faster with each one, so he made sure to throw the bigger ones first. Getting faster, Omari's confidence was fading almost as quickly as he gained it, but Jabari had no intentions of holding back. "Great job, son," he shouted, just before Omari was struck by 3 stones. Pow, pow, pow. One flew onto his back, another hit his side, and finally his shoulder. "Ow. Ow! Ow!" Omari exclaimed, wincing in pain. "Time out, time out. You must be trying to kill me this time," Omari expressed while rubbing on his injuries. "Maybe I spoke too soon," Jabari, closing the distance between them, remarked. "You should have been able to dodge those with how many times we ran that exercise. But you've never thrown them that fast before." Omari defended himself. "In combat, not all objects flying towards you will be traveling at the same speed. No one's going to shoot a blast, or anything for that matter, at you in hopes they've made it easy enough for you to dodge. You need to focus more and adapt." Jabari imported some wisdom. He also felt it necessary to remind him of something. "Remember, the last day for enrollment is in 2 weeks. You're 18 now, so one of these days I will be marching up to that base to sign your name on a list, but I won't tell you what day. As your father, I can still enroll you without you having to be present. So it's time you stepped it up a notch." Hearing those words, Omari's stomach began to turn, feeling like he could take a dump right where they stood. For him, it felt as if time was running out. He tried everything he could to convince his father not to make him join the military, but unfortunately for him, Jabari wasn't going to take no for an answer, due to the deal they had made with the king more than 18 years ago. "I don't even understand why I have to do this. I don't want to die fighting against people I don't even know. And not for Wakahira, no matter how much I love it," Omari complained, trying to stand up to his father one last time. "It's evident that I'm no fighter. I don't even like fighting in general. It's just senseless violence." Omari became frustrated as he knew this was his final attempt to get out of his situation. Honestly, Jabari felt sort of bad for his son, but it wasn't like the king was going to forget about the deal. He knew what type of person the king was from his own time in the military. The king kept records somehow, and had way too much pride to let the amount of Krugers he paid that day be for nothing. Jabari decided that, although he would enroll him anyway, he'd make one last attempt to convince his son to accept the idea. Otherwise, he thought his next move would have to be to come clean, telling his son the truth. Maybe telling him will ensure he puts his all in the trials, Jabari thought to himself, trying to look on the bright side of coming clean. Come on, son. Think of the Krugers, you'll be rewarded. You'll be able to take care of all three of us with ease. Don't you want to take care of your mother and I? I can't hunt forever, plus I doubt you would want to hunt as often as we do now, in the future. Especially if you plan on getting a regular job like you've been talking about. Don't you know those people are going to work you twice as hard as the military and for less pay? I understand your telekinesis makes doing things easier, but even that uses energy. Truth be told, Omari didn't care much for the Krugers, nor was their family struggling with Jabari being a veteran. Plus, saving on food was a big help as well. Yet it wasn't like his family would need new garments from time to time, and maybe shoes as well. Plus, they still paid taxes on their home, and the king didn't slack when it came to sending his messengers to collect it either. I would like to bring in the extra Krugers to help out, but why does it have to be like this? I don't mind working harder, plus with me being gifted, I'll get a job faster than. Faster than non-gifted, not faster than others gifted like you, Jabari interjected before his son could finish speaking. You're young, Omari, so what if another person like me comes along, someone who's been in the military? Do you think they will hire you over him with how respected the military is here? Omari put his head down, showing clear disappointment, as he had it written all over his face. Jabari placed a hand on one of his shoulders. Listen, son, how about this? If you can just give me 1 year. 1 year in the military, and if you still don't think it's for you, even after you've made all of them Krugers and seen how different your life could be, then I promise to march to that castle and tell the king to let you out. Just then, Omari's face lifted as if Jabari suddenly flipped a switch. Could you really do that? Omari asked with a slight smile. If what he says is true, then 1 year shouldn't be so bad, he thought to himself. Yes, of course. The king and I were quite close during my time. You just have to promise me you will put your all in and give it everything you've got, at least from here until the trials. Omari's smile began to grow just slightly. How about you go grab some water from the well and think about it, huh? Yes, sir, Omari replied before walking towards the front of the house. The water wells were in the middle of the intersecting brick roads used for walking, horses, and carriages. Wakahira had water wells every 4 streets apart and every few miles apart if they were on the same road. Fortunately for them and their neighbors, one sat nearby. On his way there, Omari felt like he had to make a big decision. Jabari began to ponder on the lie he told his son. Man, I wonder how I'm going to tell him I lied to him next year if he decides he wants to leave. Maybe I'll get lucky and he actually likes it. If not, I'll just have to deal with whatever comes next. Maybe I'll have to finally tell him. But I don't want him to have any ill feelings towards a king while he's in the military, though it's better than him having ill feelings towards me. I'll just have to wait and see what happens. Maybe it'll all be worth it in the end. Back at the castle, King Colin was gearing up to deal with the thief. Bowden and Isaiah arrived in elegantly designed carriages, perfectly suited for nobles. They gathered in the castle's dining area, sipping on brown liquor as they strategized their next move. King Colin sat at the head of the long rectangular table, with Isaiah and Bowden across from each other, forming a triangle. Maybe we should handle our thief quietly to prevent a chain reaction, Bowden suggested, taking a sip from his glass. It was a short glass, a lot wider, yet maybe the same height as a shot glass. If word gets out that someone tried to steal from the vault, others might think they could attempt and get away with it as well. Isaiah shot back. Unless we lock him up in the hole for life, or cut his tongue out, he'll still communicate with other prisoners. Once the word spreads, people will find out anyway. Who said anything about imprisonment? Bowden then asked with his eyes quickly moving left and right, taking another sip. Are you suggesting we kill him? For theft? Isaiah, with a somewhat surprised look on his face. Yes, it was the vault, but unless he killed someone himself, then that's not how we handle situations like this as superiors who's also supposed to be setting an example for our people. Maybe you shouldn't take any more sips. Isaiah was the most level-headed of the three. Not to say the king was always irrational, but he was less understanding than his noble, Isaiah. Bodin, however, was clearly worse than them both. The king's other noble. They all ruled over a piece of Valeraira, and could replace each other temporarily if needed, even the king, but the situation would have to be serious. Colin, being king, owned the richer part of the kingdom, where the best of everything one could think of was found: shops, food, events, you name it. Even the biggest military base and the largest peacekeeper station were there. Anyone making good Krugers moved to Wakahira. Frostmoor, the smallest village in the kingdom, was home to the lower-class people. It wasn't a dump. After all, it was still a village in the Great Kingdom. However, it was more affordable than the other two, but the downside was the crime rate was higher. Isaiah was given the village by the king due to his kind-hearted personality, after having served under him more than a few years. He was a lighter-toned individual with short dark hair, skinny yet not frail, and 65 years of age. He also has light brown eyes, thin lips, and stands at about 5 feet 8 inches tall. Bodin, however, was given the village of Ramblewood, a village mainly for middle-class people, and slightly bigger than Frostmoor. Bodin was a chubby, dark-skinned individual with a short beard and a bald head. He also had a wide nose, bigger lips than Isaiah, around the same height, and was in his early 50s. King Colin placed a hand on his glass, his expression firm. We won't have to worry about him speaking to other individuals. I don't want a man like that living in my kingdom anyway. If he wants to act like an outsider, that's how he'll be treated. I'll just banish him from our kingdom. I like the sound of that, Bodin agreed, but don't you think banishment is a bit lenient for a crime like this? I never said banishment would be his only punishment, Kalin replied, looking at them intently. I'd rather make an example of him than deal with this in silence, hidden from our people. They need to know what can happen if they go too far. Let me guess. You plan to dismember one of his limbs in front of the village folk? Isaiah asked as it was apparent to him. That's exactly what I thought about doing, as I can't think of a better way to make an example out of a bonehead of that caliber. Isaiah sighed. Knowing if it were totally up to him, he would have just imprisoned the criminal for a few years, making him think long and hard about what he had done in hopes he wouldn't return to the same path once released. He wouldn't have cared to have done it in silent, but at the same time, he wouldn't have wanted his people to see such a gruesome scene either. However, if that's what the king really wanted, then there was nothing he could do except agree. Well, if you really want to make an example, then may I suggest doing it in the courtyard? Said Isaiah. That's actually a good idea, Bodin added. There are always people in the courtyards, either with their pets, training, or doing whatever it is they do. You won't even have to make an announcement, send messengers out to alert the villagers, or anything. Both of you are absolutely correct, and this is something that I'd rather take care of as soon as possible. Like today even. We will assemble all the soldiers working in the castle and transport the criminal to the courtyard where he will face his punishment. With their meeting adjourned, the three finished their drinks and all stood up. One thing to note was that Bodin was the only one who didn't need a cane to walk. In less than 2 hours, Colin, Isaiah, Bodin, along with a handful of soldiers and Callian, who was now tied up to a short, thick log carried by a couple of strong soldiers, were ready to move out, heading towards the courtyard. The king and nobles rode in a single carriage made specially for the king, while the soldiers had to walk to the courtyard. Since it wasn't a close walk, the soldiers carrying Callian were allowed to place him down or take turns carrying him if their arms needed a break. Leaving the castle and traveling to the courtyard, villagers who were just minding their own business and going about their day soon laid their eyes on what looked like the shortest parade ever. They saw the king's carriage being driven by a soldier out in front of a group of soldiers marching in a certain direction. What threw it off was seeing a man being carried, tied to a thick log held by mainly 2 muscular soldiers, one in front and one in the back, both having the log resting on top of their shoulders. There was also one in the middle who appeared to be giving support with his hands, but looking at the other two's muscles compared to his, it seemed more as if he was just standing there for show, to make it appear as if he was helping when he actually wasn't. People could also see the king sitting in his carriage, with only a few being able to tell from where they were standing that the nobles also accompanied him. Whoever was minding their own business surely wasn't anymore, as they began to wonder what was going on. Chatting among each other as they watched the group pass by, one villager asked the one she was walking beside, "What's going on?" "How should I know? I was with you this whole time, but looking at the man on the log, it can't be good. It looks as if they are heading towards the courtyard. I wonder if we would get in trouble if we chose to follow," the male villager asked. But he wasn't the only one thinking that, as everyone watching wondered the same. Still unsure if they were making the right choice, ultimately a plethora decided to follow, while others, afraid that following would be the wrong choice, decided to continue minding their own business. As they all gathered in the huge courtyard, the soldier driving the king and two nobles hopped down, opened the door, allowing the three to step out. More people were already in the courtyard, just as confused as those who followed. Seeing the group of villagers follow, the courtyard folks assumed they had some insight into what was happening. Some couldn't help asking, hoping for an answer, but were left disappointed. In the end, everyone had to wait and see. "Place him right here," the king instructed the soldiers carrying Calian, and together they managed to stand the log upright, supporting it with their hands. The soldiers stood, keeping the log steady, while King Colin and his nobles stood in front of Calian, and the supporting soldiers with their backs turned to the crowd of people, while the rest of the soldiers stood some distance behind Calian, facing the crowd. After a few moments had passed, the king finally began to speak aloud, moving closer to Calian with his specially made cane. It was mostly wooden with a small white skull acting as a handle. "What is your name, boy?" the king demanded to know. Calian didn't respond immediately, taking a few seconds to gaze at the king standing before him. "It's Calian," he finally replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the king. "And what is your power?" the king asked. "I don't have one," Calian responded again, causing the king to be taken aback for a short moment. "You try to break into the vault, and you're not even gifted?" "Ha ha," the king laughed. "My, what confidence you have. You must steal a lot to have such a level." He made sure to speak loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people watching wore smirks, unable to believe what they were hearing. Why would a non-gifted attempt to challenge the peacekeepers of all people? He must be insane, they thought. "Well, Calian, do you realize I could cut both your hands off for a crime like this? I have no tolerance for thieves." The king took a few steps back, then turned partly around so he could see the crowd, recalling the time they were attacked by the kingdom of Shinapu and successfully sent them back to where they belonged. After that attack, many outsiders thought they could do what Calian has done and sneak into the vault. Fortunately, they were all caught, and just like young Calian here, none of them went unpunished. The king proclaimed, his voice booming. "Do you all want to know what I did?" King Colin asked the people. "I took my blade out like so," he said, lifting his cane, pulling from a skull handle, revealing a blade that popped out. Everyone except the nobles and soldiers gasped in surprise. They had no idea the king's cane concealed such a weapon. The skull handle now looked more like an intricate design as he gripped above it, firmly holding on to the wooden handle, dropping the other half of the cane that had hidden the blade. The king approached Calian once more, continuing his speech. "I cut the arms off of everyone we caught sneaking into our vault as punishment, and to you, I will do the same. Give me one of his arms." As one of the guards holding the log began to free one of Calian's arms, he started to beg and plead. "Please, I'm sorry, my king. I'm just a poor man who only steals to survive, that's all. However, if you give me one final chance, I promise to get a normal job, live a normal life, and you will never hear from me again." It's too late for apologies. This crime must not go unpunished. Clearly, the king had made up his mind hours ago on how he would handle Calian, so he wasn't going to let a few, most likely meaningless, apologies stop him. Suddenly, the eyes on the skull glowed a bright red, and within seconds, the blade was covered in active flames. The flames were intense, but not so much that they obscured the blade, which remained clearly visible. The guard stretched Calian's arm out to the side, as if Calian were going for a one-armed hug. Calian pulled and tugged, but he could not escape the guard's grasp. The guard's muscles were 10 times bigger than Calian's, who was quite slender. With one smooth swing, the sword went through Calian's arm like a sharp knife cutting through a baby carrot. His arm was detached, and as Calian yelled in pain, the guard holding his arm just dropped it like it was trash that needed to be thrown away. "Now untie the rest of him," the king ordered. Once freed, Calian immediately fell to his knees, using his good hand to lift his injured arm, tears streaming down his cheeks. He tried to press the severed limb back to the wound, as if hoping it would reattach like a puzzle piece. When it didn't work, he let out a loud cry. "And I hereby ban you from this kingdom. You must never step foot here again. If you so much as place a pinky toe within these borders, I will personally chop it off." After a few moments of looking at him, suddenly, and for the first time, the king began to feel a hint of sympathy for the young man, though he refused to show it on his face. Instead, he showed it through his words. "You too," he said, looking at the soldiers who had carried Calian, "escort him out of this village. But before you do, give him a piece of Helen plant." Everyone was taken aback, as the king had never given Helen Plant to anyone else. Luckily for Callian, the soldiers were trying to get into the habit of keeping Helen Plant on them in case of dire, unexpected situations. So all they had to do was pull it from their trousers. Helen Plant was a plant which could heal any wound or sickness within a matter of minutes. It could also heal internal wounds, even organs if need be. Just give it to him. He can apply it himself, the king spoke. Callian was curried on the shoulder of one of the large guards. As he tried his best to crush the plant, applied it around his huge wound, making sure to get the oils of the plant really in his gash, and within a few seconds of him applying, the pain was beginning to subside. An internal healing would require consuming it, which most people did by making it into tea. The healing process took a tad longer, but in the end it could even heal someone who was near death. Although he was feeling better, Callian still wouldn't have an arm.